Hey guys, welcome back to this week's lesson. This is our lesson number 5 on historical globalization. So some review from last class. We were talking about the transatlantic slave trade, and we also got into the effects that Europeans had once they arrived in North America on indigenous peoples. So we looked at the impacts of their way of life and how that changed over the years. Some review, can you explain or say what was traded between indigenous peoples and Europeans at the start of this cultural contact? Today's lesson is a continuation of cultural contact. So what happens when two cultures come together and interact with each other for the first time? Today's learning goals. I can identify what effects the arrival of Europeans had on indigenous peoples in North America. And I want you to analyze the effects the arrival of Europeans had on these indigenous peoples. Analyze meaning think about what effect it had. Was it positive or negative, and why? So what changes did the arrival of Europeans have on indigenous peoples? On this slide, I've got a little chart here that shows you some of the trade goods that were traded back and forth between indigenous peoples and European peoples as they arrived to North America. There was a lot of different goods that were traded. So for the most part, First Nations cultures were very important to the success of early Europeans like British and French, because they understood the lands. They understood the knowledge of the local wildlife. They knew how to grow local plants. They knew how to find resources. They knew the local medicines. They knew where the different rivers and lakes were and where to find the best furs. So they traded things like beaver furs, food like corn and potato, fish. They knew where to find the best resources, and they could use that to trade for other things the Europeans had. The Europeans, for the most, were trading things like firearms, guns, horses, clothing, blankets, farming equipment, manufactured goods. So even things as simple as a needle could be very useful for First Nation people. They traded a lot of metal items, axes, pots, and pans. They also brought over things like alcohol, which had negative effects on First Nations people. One of the biggest effects the arrival of Europeans had on First Nations culture was on the impact of wildlife. Before the arrival of Europeans, there were bison that were in the millions along the prairies of what is today Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and down into the United States. So these bison roamed in huge herds, and we're talking thousands and thousands at a time. Often when they would run across the plains, you could hear like a thunder because there were so many of them. The problem was Europeans viewed animals as commodities, things that they could make money off of, to buy and sell. The hides of these animals and the tongues were considered very valuable during the 1800s, which meant if you killed a bison, you didn't necessarily need its meat. You were just interested in skinning it and taking its tongue to make money. This meant that many of the bison were hunted to extinction by the end of the 1800s. You can see in the photo at the bottom a mountain of bison skulls, which shows you how many were hunted and killed at this time. The indigenous people lived off the bison for almost everything on the prairies: food, clothing, shelter, building equipment, all sorts of things. They use their bones, they use their bladder, they use their stomach to cook food in. So if the bison are going extinct, how do you think that's going to affect the indigenous people living on the prairies? The extinction of the bison led to massive starvation amongst the plains indigenous people. This meant they did not have their main food source. Indigenous people had no choice but to sign over their traditional lands to the Canadian government as more settlers arrived. They're starving. What are they going to do? They were not left with a lot of options. The government knew this. John A. Macdonald and the federal government were aware that indigenous people were at their wits' end. They were starving to death. So they weren't in a position of power. The Canadian government knew they could get what they wanted from them. And what they wanted was to open up the land so that European settlers from England and Germany and Ukraine could come and populate the prairies in places like Edmonton and Calgary, and they could push the indigenous people off the land. The Canadian government purposely continued to starve indigenous people. They did not provide them with food until they agreed to give in to their demands. Quote here, around what is now Calgary, the Blackfoot tribe had been reduced to eating grass. White travelers described coming across up to 1,000 indigenous people so starved that they could barely walk. You can see in this cartoon here, the man on the left with the hat is John A. Macdonald. He's making a deal in which he's making a lot of money off of land speculation and selling off to farmers in order to push the starving indigenous people off the land. The whiskey trade. Before the arrival of the white man, there was no alcohol per se in North America. When the white man introduced whiskey to the plains in the mid-1800s, it had a sudden and devastating effect on a deep-rooted way of life. The whiskey was made from distilled alcohol mixed with chewing tobacco, red pepper, soap, molasses, and red ink. It was labeled whoop-up juice. It was cheaply made, it was highly addictive, and it provided huge profits for the fur traders. The whiskey brought among us the traders is fast killing us off, said Crowfoot. We are powerless before this evil. We are unable to resist the temptation to drink when brought in contact with the white man's water. For many of these people, they had never experienced something so addictive before. It's like a drug. And once you're addicted to that, it can start to destroy your life. And you will maybe start to trade or do anything in order to get that alcohol. And so the fur traders would trade this whiskey for the best furs, but they would get indigenous people so drunk and so addictive that they would not make the best decisions when they were making these trades. The Hudson's Bay used to have a fort known as Fort Edmonton, close to downtown in where our legislature is. There was an area not far from Ross Shepherd that was called Drunken Indian Lake. And that was a lake in where they would trade this whiskey and get everybody nice and drunk before coming to the fort so that they weren't thinking clearly when they were trading. As First Nations tribes continued to starve and more settlers arrived, they were forced to sign treaties. During the years 1870 to 1921, Canada signed 13 treaties across the provinces. You can see Alberta here has Treaty 8, Treaty 6, Treaty 7, a little bit of Treaty 10, and a little bit of Treaty 4. Edmonton and Ross Shepherd is located on Treaty 6 territory. These treaties were designed to remove indigenous peoples from their lands, placing them on small reserves and thus making room for new settlers to move west. Take a look at this video here. I've linked it from minutes 29 to 32. Feel free to watch the whole video if you'd like, but there's an important 3 minutes there that I'd like you to see. This video clip goes over how often the Canadian government broke a lot of promises to First Nations tribes over the years and did not fulfill their treaties when Indigenous people were signing these treaties. They believed they were making a partnership to take care of the land and to take care of themselves moving forward so that they could be successful. A lot of what the government did was going back on its promises, and as we see moving forward, kind of taking advantage of Indigenous people. Reserves are small plots of land in which Indigenous peoples were forced onto to live. The government, when they gave them these lands, they promised them farming equipment and said, we're going to make you into good farmers who could make a lot of money and support your tribe. Once they moved them into these reserves, very little farm equipment was ever delivered. These reserves were often put on land that was not even suitable for farming in the first place, was very far away from other towns, railroads, any job opportunities, or any place to sell what you'd be farming in the first place. Most of these reserves are in northern Alberta, and you can see the best farmland is kind of down here. A lot of these reserves were placed on areas that had swamps and were not good for farming at all. In this cartoon, you can see the white man is holding some money bags labeled profits. The indigenous man's package says starvation. The white man is profiting by kicking the indigenous off of their land. So think about how this continues to affect Canadians today. We are very lucky we live in Edmonton. We have a lot of job opportunities here. We have good schools, good parks. A lot of the indigenous people still continue to live on reserves. And on these reserves, they basically are under the control or watch of a lot of government regulation. They're dependent on them for money. And a lot of people sometimes they get annoyed when they hear that First Nations people get money every year. They say, why should they get that money? Well, these are promises that were made to them a long time ago. And we are continuing to see that these promises were not lived up to. We're going to continue into the next lesson where we will look at some of the major effects that these broken promises had on Indigenous people. Once you've gone over those slides, you can begin your online Lesson 7 questions. So they're very similar to previous lessons with the slide numbers. Some of these questions ask you to interpret some of the cartoons we've talked about. Okay? I also want you to take some time to imagine what it would be like if you were a young Indigenous teenager living in 1876. Your family had just moved to a new reserve, isolated in northern Alberta. Your tribe has been separated from each other. And now you are required to wait for the Canadian government to give you the food you need and the farming supplies. I want you to imagine what it would be like and create a journal entry, a cartoon, a video blog so you could record yourself, or write a poem of what it might be like and what you would be feeling at that time. Okay guys, I know you can do a great job at this, so please let me know if you have any questions and I will chat with you at our Google Meet. Take care.